All right, on this True Law Stories, we're going to talk with the flying lawyer of Alamance County, Mr. Julian Doby. Julian, say hello to everyone.
Hello.
And we're going to talk about his two most important pieces of advice about being an attorney, and they both involve coffee. About a Marine that he helped from Camp Lejeune who was charged, interrogated, and confessed of rape of an Elon student and what happened at the trial. The reality of forced confessions, innocent man that was accused of cocaine trafficking because of his accent, and assault on a female charges in Alamance County because of a bucket of pennies. All this on True Law Stories. But of course, this is brought to you by videocasestory.com. One of the best ways to get more clients, to get more business is through your stories. Go to videocasestory.com where we can help you collect, craft, and deliver those on YouTube and other places. All right, let's get started. Alamance is a very pretty little town. I've been there, or county, I should say. I've been there quite a few times. And Julie, before we get started, we're going to talk about like a Marine who was arrested and then crazy assault on a female with pennies. But tell us a little bit about your practice.
I've been practicing for 25 years now here in Alamance County, and I've pretty much handled cases in all parts of the state, but primarily here in the Alamance, Guilford, Orange counties. I also have a practice in Wilmington now. I fortunately am able to travel back and forth because I've got a plane that allows me to do that. That's been a fun addition, getting my pilot's license. So,
Yeah, that's cool. That's awesome.
yeah, the flying lawyer, I guess. So, but I've got a general practice, but it's primarily, I've been a criminal defense practice from the onset. I did a lot of court of appointed work early on, and then everything was privately retained.
Gotcha. Yeah, the plane must be nice. I've taken that drive through to Wilmington, and once you hit, you feel like you're almost there, and then you've got another hour down the highway.
It's a long drive. I've done that too.
Yeah, it is a long drive, but that's fantastic. Throughout your years of doing criminal defense, it's pretty intense. You see some crazy stuff. How do you keep your head above water? Like, how do you keep an even keel handling all these types of cases?
Well, I had some great advice, even during law school, from some presenters and some speakers that were brought in that were very seasoned criminal defense lawyers. And one thing that they suggested is that you have coffee with your colleagues. And I know that sounds strange, but meeting other criminal attorneys, sharing stories, and just talking about the way that you conduct yourself as an attorney and how you navigate the process was very helpful. The second piece of advice was don't have coffee with your clients. And I'm one of those guys that has a huge heart. I'm always able to keep my client in the place of being a client. And you're the lawyer and you have to give advice. I think if you keep those things in perspective and you try to have a well-balanced life yourself, you can't run wild and expect to have a decent law practice. There are people that are able to function like that, but you need a balanced life so that you can keep all of this in perspective, I think.
Oh yeah, I can't imagine. Because you definitely have people's lives on the line every day, and it's got to
Yeah,
be.
penalty case. I still have probably in the past 5 years, I've had 10 first degree murder cases.
Wow.
And navigating those and managing through those have been a challenge.
Oh yeah, and you. I guess probably the hardest thing is when you have an innocent person that you know is innocent. It's varieties. There's a lot of people wrong. We've talked about it before in this show. Wrong time, bad place, bad timing. They might have done something a little. They're getting strung up for something worse. But then there's completely innocent people, aren't there?
There are those, and for the most part, law enforcement isn't out there just making up stories about all this. There's a certain amount of this that clearly occurred. There's crimes that do occur every single day. We can't turn a blind eye to that. But a lot of people are overcharged or charged with something they didn't do, have less culpability. I see that daily. And then, of course, you have the person that just totally has nothing to do with the crime and gets caught up in it either by association or by improper investigation. In a perfect world, the police would investigate everything thoroughly and properly, and every charge would stick, right? But we live with human beings, and that means we're living in an imperfect world altogether.
Yes. Yeah. And tell me a little bit about the story about the Marine that you defended.
Yeah, that was a very involved and stressful case. I ended up trying it back in 2013. This Marine from Camp Lejeune was charged with second-degree rape, which is by statute the rape or having sex with a person that was too intoxicated to have consented, or essentially unconscious, was the allegations. And pretty much the facts that are undisputed are that these two, the Elon student who was in her freshman year at Elon, and my client who was a Marine, were high school friends. And my client and his two friends drove up to Elon on Labor Day weekend break to hang out and party with the Elon girls. And they went to several sororities and fraternity parties and ended up back in the girls' dorm rooms. And they all lived in the same floor of this dorm at Elon. Eventually, my client and the alleged victim ended up going to a separate room, her room, and at some point in the night they had sex, and the next morning got up, had small conversation, and then my client and the two other guys who also slept with the other two girls left and went back to Camp Lejeune. Probably 2 to 3 weeks later, the Naval NCIS, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, I think there was a TV show about it, but one of those guys had picked up my Marine and took him in for questioning, gave him a polygraph, told him he flunked the polygraph without that actually being confirmed. And again, remember, polygraphs are not admissible in evidence in any court of law. They're just not reliable and aren't scientifically proven. But they convinced him that he had lied, had him crying over hours of interrogation, and eventually got him to sign a statement saying that he had sex with someone who was unconscious. So they had a written confession, essentially, which was damning for me, because the Elon police had investigated it and gotten nowhere.
Oh.
But NCIS, through their interrogation process, ended up getting a written, signed, dated confession from my client.
Wow.
And
yeah, how do you handle that?
It was very difficult. We hired an expert from Yale on false confessions and retained him, which was very expensive, and got him to come down to testify. Now, the judge heard our proffer of evidence and did not allow him to testify as an expert after all that.
Wow.
But it did get into the newspapers. And if you think that juries don't read newspapers on their nights between court dates, I think we're all mistaken, because they do. They get the newspaper's interpretation of what happened in court. But in any event, it was probably a week and a half trial through, I obviously put the other Marines on. We had the alleged victim on the stand. She didn't come off well at all on the stand. I was giggling and laughing through half of it. And I don't think the jury liked her. And I'll tell you, one thing I do on sex offense cases, when I'm representing a male, I put females on that jury. And several people would be like, "What are you thinking?" But historically, females are very skeptical and suspicious of other females' testimony on the stand. particularly in a sex offense case. And that might be different. You don't want sex offense victims
No.
on your jury in a case like that, clearly. But I'll take 9 out of 12 females on a case like that any day. And I took as many as I could put on there. And after a week and a half of listening to all that, listening to the NCIS investigator, the polygraph guy, and seeing the written confession, we ended up with a hung jury. And I think it was 9-3 in favor of not guilty is how it ended up.
Wow.
3 holdouts. And we ended up, and so what that does is the judge, if they're clearly a hung jury after several tries, a judge ends up declaring a mistrial, which he did in that particular case. So the case doesn't get dismissed at that point. The DA had the election of trying the case again, dismissing it, or some other resolution. We ended up pleading to a misdemeanor battery in, I believe, April of that year. So 4 months after the trial, we worked out a misdemeanor battery, and he was out of state and was able to eventually leave. And it was a short probationary term.
That's I guess that's a pretty good outcome when you consider there was a confession.
Yes, it is, and considering the fact that he was facing probably 8 or 9 years at a minimum.
Wow.
On those charges.
And did he, with that, just out of curiosity, did he end up staying in the Marines? How does that work?
No, he I believe a general right after the NCIS interrogation.
Wow.
I'm sure he was called in and ended up taking that. It might have been an honorable discharge. I can't remember exactly how that went, but he was definitely separated from service.
It's crazy. It's just, it's one of those things. It may have happened, may not have happened, but but when there's a confession, forced confession, that's just skid. And that can happen pretty easily. That doesn't mean that you had an expert on it. That happens more often than we realize, doesn't it?
Yeah, I see a lot of written statement by people who even the evidence has contradicted. And a lot of people do interviews with police that are recorded, video and audio. And it's amazing to me the number of false statements that are made that aren't meant to be self-serving. They end up being damaging, but then it wasn't exactly how it played out. I've seen it on multiple occasions. And it's hard to reel that back in. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube once it's out. So damage control is pretty much the most that you can do in those situations. And fortunately for my Marine in that case, I think a good result ended up after everything.
Yeah, it sounds like one of the best results he could have had. And so moving on to this other story you have about a man wrongfully accused of dealing cocaine or smuggling it?
Trafficking in cocaine.
Trafficking.
We have in Alamance County, we used to be a textile community when the United States actually produced textile over the years. Most of that's gone overseas now, but we still have some textiles left or facility. And we also have a good bit of construction. So we have a decent sized Hispanic population here that work in both the mills and in construction. And my client in the trafficking case was one of those. Now, they lived in a mobile home out in we'll call it in the rural part of the county. And there was probably 6 of them living in this mobile home. My client actually slept on the couch and kept his clothes in a bag in the corner. But police were tipped off that there was some drug activity that happened from the residence or around the residence. So they came and did what vice units do, a knock and talk, hoping to gain entry and then be able to the mobile home. And my client worked third shift and had just gotten home from work and was the only person there at the mobile home at the time that the sheriff's deputies arrived. He gave them consent to search. They said as they looked through the window, they saw him carry this box, this red box, to the back, and they didn't know what he was doing with it. But he came back and let them in, and he allowed them to search. And they searched, and in the laundry room, they found this red box that they said he was carrying, and it was full of cocaine. It's almost a kilo of cocaine.
Whoa.
A large trafficking amount. And my client wore up and down. He had nothing to do with it. His employer was very much behind him. He was there at work every day. And he was clearly innocent. One of those cases that I have that I just absolutely knew my client had nothing to do with it. And I think that the officers fabricated the story about him holding that box. And they said that he had admitted that was his. They said what he said was, yes, it's mine. But it was funny. I had to put him on the stand. And what he was saying when I said, was that cocaine yours? Was this box yours? Did you have it? He said, it's mine. And there's a knot in there that we can't hear, but his dialect made it sound like he was saying, it's mine. But he was saying, it's not mine.
Oh.
The jury believed it. They listened to him, and they ended up finding him not guilty. Of course, he did not have his legal status here. So they ended up deporting him back to Colombia. So it wasn't the best result for him, but it was by far the best result I could get in that case for him.
And it's better than spending time in jail here or getting deported and spending time in jail.
He had a year before that trial, so he did a year in the county jail waiting trial. So
oh my gosh,
he paid some dues.
Yeah, I would say. Oh, how does that feel? How did it feel throughout the trial, and then how did it feel like right before you got the verdict, and then hearing that?
Yeah, so in a case, those are the hardest cases for us by far. When you know you have an innocent person. And you want the jury to do the right thing. And I trust juries. That's one thing you have to do. If you don't, you definitely won't make it in this business, and you won't know how to pick jurors, which is an art into itself. But the stress level is very high. You don't sleep a lot during those trials, even if they're short trials. You don't get a lot of rest, and you're trusting that jury to do the right thing, but you have to present the evidence in the best light that you can for your client so that you've left it all out on the table before they go back and deliberate. The judge is going to give them these long instructions, and they never listen to the judge. A lot of them are sleeping during the instructions, so you have to captivate them during your closing, get their attention, make your points, and get out of there. And that's what I did. And, I remember him thanking me before the jury came back and said, you really did a good job. I know you did all you could. And it was just so much of a relief when they came back with a not guilty verdict.
Yeah, I can only imagine. It stinks, but he's deported and lost his job, but still, that's pretty amazing. Because that's a scary situation. And for that much, you're facing some jail time, aren't you?
Oh, yeah. A minimum of, I think it was 72 months to 100 and some months on that particular amount that he had.
Wow.
And I think it was a $250,000 to $1 million fine. It could have been catastrophic for him.
Oof. Yeah. Those are fantastic stories. I know they don't always end up that way. And but those seem sometimes the best outcomes for something like that. But you've got a crazy story about a woman being assaulted with pennies.
Yeah. Of course, the stakes weren't quite as high in that case. It was the highest level of misdemeanor charge you can have, assault on a female, which it ought to be, is a class A1 misdemeanor, punishable by a maximum of 150 days in jail. But my client had no record, and he had a service dog who apparently had gotten loose and didn't have a rabies tag. The county animal services had picked it up, taken it to the shelter. He located it there, and they charged him some money, a fee, because he didn't have the rabies tag. They had to give him an injection and put the tag on. And he was a little upset about that, so he decided to pay his fee with a bucket of penny instead of regular cash or credit card or anything like that. I don't know how he saved up that many pennies, or if he went to the bank and cashed some money and got it. I don't know. But he came into the animal shelter over the cashier's counter and poured the bucket of pennies on her desk. And some of them trickled over and fell in her lap. She was upset and ended up having the sheriff charge him with assault on a female. So we ended up trying the case, and when you try misdemeanors, they're just in front of a judge. You don't have a jury. And this particular judge was fairly new, so I didn't know exactly what he would do in a case like this. But I made the argument that we've got this guy, we might say, hey, he was a jerk on that day. You know, whatever we think about him pouring the pennies on the table, it doesn't amount to a crime of assault on a female, because we're bunching him up with all these guys who beat their wives that get charged every day. It just doesn't fit in that category.
No, not at all.
And so the judge debated it for a while, and I didn't know what he was going to do.
Gosh.
And he ended up finding the guy not guilty, but he gave him one of the most stern warnings about behavior that I've heard. I'll take a stern warning any day for a not guilty.
No, for sure. That's crazy, though. It's just like, oh my God. Yeah, you never would think that. I'm sure even though he was upset, I would never, ever think that someone could be charged with anything for just dumping a bucket of pennies somewhere.
From the many years growing up watching Perry Mason episodes to undergrad and going to law school, coming out, never in all that process did I ever think I'd be representing a guy dumping pennies on a table.
I'm sure you've done, yeah, that's crazy. I'm sure you've done a lot of things you never thought you were going to do, or heard of a lot of things that you never thought you'd hear.
Clearly.
Oh man, this has been crazy. Julian, tell me a little bit more about if someone is charged with dumping pennies or something more serious. How do we get a hold of you?
I've got my office in Graham, and I also have one in Wilmington. The best way to reach me is 336-221-8900, or look me up online. We've got the websites. We're on social media, and we're obviously in the business of helping people.
Yeah. And we'll put a link to all that in the show notes. Well, Julian Doby, thank you so much for being on True Law Stories.
Thanks, Ian.
And thank you for taking Mr. Doby and I on your journey to spin iron garlic and True Law Stories.